He canceled our anniversary dinner, Margaret Collins said quietly to herself, standing alone in the kitchen as the clock ticked past 7. The table still set for two with candles that had already burned halfway down. 45 years of marriage. And Daniel had never missed a single anniversary before. Not even the year he had the flu. Not even the year their son Ethan had been hospitalized. But tonight, he had simply called an hour earlier with a flat voice and said something had come up, and that they would celebrate another time. And Margaret had paused with the phone pressed to her ear, waiting for more. Waiting for warmth. For an explanation. For anything that sounded like the man she had built her entire life around. But none came. Just a brief silence, and then the line went dead. And now the house felt too quiet, too still. As if something had shifted in a way she could not yet name. She moved slowly around the dining room, adjusting a fork that did not need adjusting, smoothing a napkin that had already been perfectly folded. Her movements calm, deliberate, almost mechanical. The way they always were when something unsettled her more deeply than she was willing to admit. Outside, the late evening light faded across their suburban street, the same street they had moved into over 3 decades ago, the same house where she had raised Ethan, where she had hosted birthdays and holidays and Sunday dinners, where she had believed, without question, that her place in this family was secure. And yet, as she glanced at Daniel's empty chair, a faint unease settled into her chest. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just a quiet, persistent feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the canceled dinner. She told herself. People got busy. Things happen, especially at their age. But it was the way he had sounded. Distant, distracted, as though he had already moved on from the moment before it had even begun. She picked up her phone, hesitating for a second before unlocking it, not to call him back, not to ask questions, but simply to look, to scroll, to occupy the silence with something ordinary, something harmless. And that was when she noticed it. A notification that had come through earlier, one she had ignored at the time. A shared calendar update from Daniel's account, something he rarely used, something he had never cared about before. And now there it was, a small, almost insignificant detail. Yet it caught her attention immediately. The entry was brief, just a time and a location, nothing more. But the time overlapped perfectly with their canceled dinner, and the location. Margaret stared at it a moment longer than necessary, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she were simply reading any other line of text. But inside, a quiet realization began to form, slow and heavy, like a piece of truth rising to the surface. She did not react. She did not call him. She did not question it out loud. Instead, she locked her phone, set it face down on the table, and reached over to blow out one of the candles, watching as the flame flickered and disappeared into a thin trail of smoke. Then the second, then the third. The room dimmed, settling into shadow, and Margaret stood there for a moment, perfectly still, her face calm, her posture composed, but her mind already moving, already shifting from confusion to something else, something quieter, colder, more deliberate, because for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what Daniel had done. She was thinking about why, and more importantly, she was beginning to understand that whatever the answer was, it wasn't going to be simple, and it wasn't going to be something she could ignore. Margaret did not sleep much that night, not because she was overwhelmed, but because her mind refused to settle into the simple explanation she had offered herself earlier, and instead kept returning to that small detail on Daniel's calendar, replaying it with quiet persistence until it no longer felt like an accident or a coincidence but something intentional, something placed there without the expectation that she would notice, and that, more than anything else, unsettled her. By morning, the house carried on exactly as it always had. Sunlight filtering through the kitchen blinds, the coffee maker clicking on at 6:30 sharp, the familiar hum of a routine she had followed for years without thinking, and Margaret moved through it with the same steady precision, pouring her coffee, setting out a single plate for breakfast, folding the newspaper beside her as though nothing had changed, even though something clearly had. Daniel came downstairs later than usual, already dressed. His movements slightly hurried, and for a brief moment their eyes met across the kitchen. Just a second. But it was enough for Margaret to notice what was missing. Not guilt, not even discomfort, but a kind of careful neutrality, as if he had already decided what this morning was going to be, and had no intention of deviating from it. He mentioned a meeting, something about needing to step out for a few hours, his tone casual. Practice. And Margaret nodded, offering a small, polite smile, the kind she had perfected over decades of maintaining peace in a household where emotions were often left unspoken. And she did not ask where he was going. She did not mention the dinner. She did not reference the calendar entry, because something inside her had shifted overnight, something subtle but firm, a decision to observe rather than react. After he left, the house fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, not empty, but expectant, as if it were holding space for something that had not yet fully revealed itself. And Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the faint echo of the front door closing, the sound lingering in a way that made her feel as though she had just witnessed the beginning of something rather than the end of a simple evening. She returned to the dining room, where the faint scent of extinguished candles still lingered, and began clearing the table, her movements slow and methodical, but her attention elsewhere, replaying recent weeks with a clarity she had not allowed herself before. Small changes that had seemed insignificant at the time now aligning in ways that felt too precise to ignore. The late phone calls Daniel had started taking in the other room, the sudden interest in updating documents he had not touched in years, the way Sophia had begun visiting more frequently, always with a reason that sounded reasonable on the surface, always with that same polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Margaret paused with a plate in her hands, the realization forming not as a shock, but as a quiet confirmation of something she had already begun to suspect, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, she set the plate down carefully, wiped her hands on a towel, and walked over to the small desk by the window where Daniel kept his paperwork, not searching frantically, not invading, just looking, gently, deliberately, as if she already knew that whatever she was about to find would not raise its voice, it would simply be there, waiting to be noticed. Margaret did not rush as she opened the top drawer of Daniel's desk, her movements steady, almost routine, as though she were simply looking for a misplaced receipt or an old utility bill. But her eyes were sharper now, more attentive to the details she had once overlooked. And it did not take long before she noticed that things were no longer arranged the way they used to be. Folders shifted slightly out of place, documents stacked with a kind of careless urgency that did not match Daniel's usual meticulous habits, and that alone was enough to confirm that something had changed long before she had allowed herself to see it. She lifted a thin folder and flipped through it slowly, not searching for anything specific, just letting the information reveal itself in its own time. Bank statements, insurance papers, old tax documents, all familiar, all expected, until one page caught her attention, a printed confirmation of a recent appointment, not medical, not financial, but something legal, something scheduled quietly, without discussion, and Margaret paused, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper as she read the date again, the time, the location. And this time, there was no mistaking the connection. It matched the entry she had seen the night before. Exactly, down to the minute. She did not react outwardly, did not allow her expression to shift, but inside, a quiet clarity began to take shape, not as a sudden realization, but as a series of small truths aligning into something undeniable. And for the first time, she stopped asking herself if she was imagining things, because she knew she was not. A faint sound from outside drew her attention, a car door closing somewhere down the street, and Margaret instinctively glanced toward the window, though she did not move closer, did not try to confirm anything just yet, because she understood now that rushing would only cloud what she was beginning to see clearly. Instead, she placed the document back exactly where she had found it, smoothing the edges, aligning the corners, leaving no sign that she had been there at all, and closed the drawer with the same quiet care. The house felt different again. Not unfamiliar, but no longer entirely safe in the way it once had. And Margaret stood in the center of the room for a moment, listening to the stillness, her breathing slow, controlled, her posture unchanged, but her awareness sharpened in a way that made everything around her feel more defined, more intentional. Later that afternoon, when Ethan and Sophia arrived unannounced, Margaret greeted them as she always did, with a warm smile and a gentle tone, inviting them in, offering coffee, asking about their week, and on the surface, everything appeared normal, the conversation polite, the atmosphere calm, but beneath it, there was something else now, something Margaret could not ignore. The way Sophia's eyes flickered briefly toward Daniel's empty chair before settling back on Margaret, the way Ethan avoided certain topics, redirecting the conversation with a practiced ease that felt rehearsed rather than natural. Margaret noticed all of it, every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word, and she responded in kind, not by confronting them, not by revealing what she had begun to understand, but by listening more closely than she ever had before, allowing the silence between their words to speak just as clearly as the words themselves. And as the afternoon wore on, one thought settled firmly in her mind, quiet but unshakable. This was not something that had happened overnight. This had been building, slowly, deliberately, right in front of her, and she had only just begun to see it. That evening, after Ethan and Sophia left, Margaret remained seated in the living room long after the front door had closed, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the window where the last traces of daylight had already faded, and for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to revisit memories she had carefully preserved as simple, uncomplicated truths, moments that once felt warm and certain now taking on a different shape when viewed through the quiet clarity she had gained. She thought about the early years of her marriage, when Daniel would come home from work and find her in the kitchen, wrapping his arms around her without a word, the way he used to remember small details, like how she preferred her coffee or the exact date of their first vacation together, and how those gestures had slowly become less frequent, replaced over time by routine, then by distance, and now, by something she could no longer define as familiarity. Margaret leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts moving with quiet precision, connecting moments that had once seemed isolated, harmless even, into something far more deliberate. The time Daniel had insisted on handling all their financial documents alone, saying it would be easier that way. The way Sophia had begun asking questions about the house, about ownership, about what would happen in the future, always framed as concern, always delivered with that same gentle tone that made it difficult to question her intentions at the time. There had been small things too, details so subtle that Margaret had dismissed them without a second thought, like the way conversations would shift when she entered a room, the brief pause, the exchanged glance, the quick change of subject, moments that now replayed in her mind with a clarity that made them impossible to ignore. She stood slowly and walked toward the hallway, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor, pausing briefly outside the room that had once belonged to Ethan, now used occasionally when he and Sophia stayed over. And though the door was closed, Margaret did not open it, did not need to, because she understood now that the answers she was searching for were not hidden in a single place. They were woven into the pattern of the past few years, quietly building while she continued to believe that everything was exactly as it should be. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water and stood by the sink, looking out into the dark backyard, the faint outline of the garden still visible under the porch light, a space she had cared for with the same attention she had given to her family, nurturing it, maintaining it, believing that with enough patience and consistency, things would continue to grow in the right direction. But now, that belief felt fragile, not shattered, but no longer unquestioned. Margaret took a small sip of water and set the glass down carefully, her movements as controlled as ever, but her awareness sharper than it had been in years, because she was no longer simply remembering, she was understanding, and with that understanding came something new. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet, steady shift in perspective. The kind that did not announce itself loudly, but settled in deeply, changing the way everything would be seen from that moment forward. The next morning, Margaret did something she had not done in years. She left the house without telling anyone where she was going, not out of secrecy, but out of a quiet need to step outside the version of her life that had begun to feel carefully managed by others. And as she drove through familiar streets, past the grocery store she had visited every week for decades, past the small cafe where she and Daniel used to share breakfast on Sundays, she realized how much of her routine had been shaped around maintaining a sense of normalcy that no longer truly existed. She parked her car near a quiet park on the edge of town and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, her reflection faintly visible in the windshield. And for the first time, she looked at herself not as a wife, not as a mother, but simply as Margaret, a woman who had spent years trusting that the people closest to her were moving in the same direction, only to now recognize that they may have been moving around her instead. She stepped out of the car and walked slowly along the path, the morning air cool against her skin, the sound of distant traffic blending with the rustle of leaves, and her thoughts continued to settle into something clearer, more defined, not a storm of emotion, but a steady alignment of facts she could no longer ignore. It was not just Daniel's behavior, and it was not just Sophia's subtle presence in moments where she did not quite belong. It was the way Ethan had begun to distance himself, not abruptly, but gradually, as if guided by something unspoken, something that had quietly shifted his loyalty away from the woman who had raised him. Margaret paused near a bench and sat down, folding her hands in her lap as she observed the world around her, people passing by, each absorbed in their own routines, their own lives, and for a brief moment, she felt a strange sense of detachment, not loneliness, but clarity, the kind that comes when illusions begin to fall away. She thought back to a conversation from a few months ago, one she had dismissed at the time, when Sophia had casually mentioned how complicated property ownership could become later in life, how important it was to have everything clearly documented, how families sometimes faced unnecessary challenges if things were not properly arranged, and Margaret had nodded politely, trusting that the concern was genuine, that the intention was to help. But now, that conversation echoed differently in her mind, not as advice, but as preparation. When she returned home later that morning, the house was exactly as she had left it, quiet, orderly, unchanged on the surface. But Margaret stepped inside with a different awareness, her eyes taking in the familiar details with a sharper focus. The framed photographs along the hallway, the certificates and documents neatly stored away, the life she had built, piece by piece, now seen not just as memories, but as assets, as something that could be measured, transferred, possibly even taken. She moved through the house slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, and as she reached the desk once more, she did not open it immediately, did not search again, because she understood now that what she needed was not just evidence, but understanding, a complete picture of what had been set in motion around her. And for the first time, Margaret was no longer trying to protect the life she had known. She was beginning to prepare for what she would do once the truth fully revealed itself. That afternoon, Margaret made a phone call she had not planned the day before, her fingers dialing the number slowly, deliberately, as if each digit carried a weight she fully understood. And when the voice on the other end answered, warm and professional, she did not hesitate or explain too much. She simply asked if there was availability to review some personal documents, framing it as routine, as something any responsible person might do. And the appointment was set without complication, without suspicion, just another entry in a day that, on the surface, remained ordinary. When she arrived at the small office later, the space felt neutral, almost detached from the rest of her life. Quiet walls, neatly arranged files, a place where things were handled directly, without the emotional layers that had clouded her home. And as she sat across from the man who had assisted her family years ago, Margaret spoke calmly, presenting her questions as practical concerns about ownership, about documentation, about what would happen under certain circumstances, and she listened carefully as he explained the details, the processes, the implications of changes that could be made without her knowledge if she was not actively involved. There was no dramatic revelation, no single sentence that confirmed everything, but there was something more important, a clear understanding of how easily decisions could be redirected, how signatures, timing, and quiet agreements could shift control from one person to another. And as she absorbed this information, Margaret felt the final piece settle into place, not with shock, but with a quiet certainty that what she had sensed was not only possible, but likely already in motion. She thanked him, gathered her papers, and left with the same composed expression she had carried in. But as she stepped back into the daylight, the world seemed sharper, more defined, as if the uncertainty that had lingered over the past days had finally taken shape into something she could see clearly. When she returned home, Daniel was already there, seated in the living room, his posture relaxed, his tone casual as he asked where she had been, and Margaret answered simply, saying she had run a few errands, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, and for a brief moment, there was a pause between them, subtle, almost imperceptible, but different from the pauses before, because this time, Margaret was not searching for reassurance, she was observing. Later that evening, as dinner unfolded in its usual quiet rhythm, she noticed how Daniel avoided certain topics, how he redirected conversations with practiced ease, and how, when Sophia's name came up in passing, his reaction was just a fraction too quick, just a little too controlled. And Margaret registered it without comment, without reaction, storing each detail the way she now stored everything, carefully, precisely. As the night settled in and the house grew still once more, Margaret stood by the window, looking out into the darkness, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. And there was no confusion left in her expression, no hesitation in her posture, because she was no longer trying to understand what was happening. She was beginning to understand what she would need to do next. And that shift, quiet and contained, marked a point from which there would be no return. In the days that followed, Margaret did not change her routine in any noticeable way, at least not to anyone watching from the outside. She still prepared meals at the same time, still kept the house in the same careful order, still greeted Daniel with the same calm presence that had defined their life together for decades. But beneath that surface, something had shifted completely, and every action she took now carried a quiet intention that had not been there before. She began paying closer attention to the details that once felt too small to matter. The timing of Daniel's phone calls, the pattern of his absences, the subtle way his tone changed depending on the topic, and she noticed how often Sophia's name appeared in conversations that had nothing to do with her, always introduced casually, always framed as incidental, yet never entirely random. Margaret did not interrupt, did not question. She simply listened, allowing the pieces to arrange themselves without interference, because she understood now that the truth revealed itself more clearly when it was not forced. One afternoon, while Daniel stepped outside to take a call, Margaret remained in the living room, her posture relaxed, her attention seemingly on the book in her hands, but her awareness extended beyond the pages, catching fragments of his voice through the slightly open window. Not the full conversation, just enough to recognize the tone, softer, more deliberate, and when he returned, there was a faint shift in his expression, quickly concealed, but not fast enough to escape her notice. Later that evening, she moved through the house with quiet purpose, pausing briefly near the hallway where Daniel had left his jacket, and without hesitation, she reached into the pocket, not searching blindly, but checking, confirming, and there it was, a folded receipt from a place she recognized, not immediately, but after a moment, the location aligning with the entry she had seen days earlier. And Margaret held it for just a second longer than necessary before placing it back exactly as she had found it, her movements precise, leaving no trace. She did not confront him. She did not react. Instead, she continued as if nothing had changed, because in her mind, everything already had. That night, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, the conversation light, almost ordinary, Margaret watched him with a clarity she had never possessed before, not as a wife seeking reassurance, but as someone observing a pattern unfold, and for the first time, she realized how much of their interaction had become performance, how carefully words were chosen, how deliberately certain topics were avoided, and how easily silence could be used to maintain the illusion of normalcy. When Daniel excused himself early, citing fatigue, Margaret nodded gently, her expression unchanged, and waited until the house had settled into its usual quiet before she walked slowly to the desk once more. And this time, she did not hesitate. She opened the drawer and took out the same folder she had seen before, not to search, but to confirm what she already knew. And as she read through the documents again, her understanding solidified into something firm, something undeniable. Margaret closed the folder, returned it to its place, and stood there for a moment in the dim light, her face calm, her breathing steady, but her thoughts no longer uncertain, because she was not gathering suspicions anymore. She was gathering proof, and with each quiet confirmation, the distance between what she had believed and what was actually happening grew clearer, sharper, until there was no space left for doubt, only the quiet, steady preparation for what would come next. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that usually passed without leaving any mark at all. And that was precisely why Margaret noticed it, because Daniel said he would be out for just a short while. Something about picking up a document, something routine, something that did not require explanation. And Margaret nodded as she always did, offering no resistance, no curiosity. Only that same calm presence that had become almost invisible in its consistency. But this time, after he left, she did not return to her usual tasks. She did not busy herself with cleaning or cooking. Instead, she stood still for a moment in the center of the room, her decision forming not out of impulse, but from the steady accumulation of everything she had already seen, everything she had already confirmed, and without hesitation, she reached for her keys. The drive was not long. The address already familiar in her mind from the documents and receipts she had quietly collected. And as she pulled into the parking lot, she did not feel nervous. She did not feel afraid. She felt something else entirely. A calm clarity that made every movement deliberate, every step measured. She parked at a distance, not hiding, not rushing, simply observing. And within minutes, she saw his car, exactly where she expected it to be, and for a brief moment, she remained seated, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her breathing steady, as if giving herself one final chance to turn away, to choose not to see what she already knew was waiting. But she did not move away. She stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the building, her pace unhurried, her expression composed. And when she reached the entrance, she paused just long enough to notice the reflection in the glass. Her own face looking back at her. Controlled, almost unfamiliar in its certainty. Inside, the space was quiet, professional, a place where people came to handle important matters, and Margaret moved through it without drawing attention, her eyes scanning the room until they settled on a familiar figure seated across from someone she recognized immediately. Daniel. And beside him, Sophia. They were not sitting close, not touching, not doing anything that could be described as openly inappropriate, but the way they leaned slightly toward each other, The way their conversation flowed with an ease that did not belong to chance, the way their attention remained entirely focused on what was in front of them, it was enough. Margaret did not approach them. She did not speak. She simply stood there for a moment, taking in the scene exactly as it was, without exaggeration, without interpretation, because she no longer needed to guess. The documents on the table between them were visible enough, pages marked, signatures prepared, and even from a distance, Margaret could recognize the nature of what was happening, not every detail, not every clause, but enough to understand the intention behind it, enough to confirm that decisions were being made, quietly, deliberately, without her. She turned away before they could notice her, her movements just as controlled as they had been when she entered, and walked back outside into the open air, the door closing softly behind her, and for a moment, she stood there again, not overwhelmed, not shaken, but still, as if allowing the final piece of the truth to settle into place. Because now, there was nothing left to question, nothing left to interpret, only the quiet, undeniable reality of what she had just seen, and the understanding that whatever came next would no longer be about discovering the truth, but about what she chose to do with it. Margaret drove home without turning on the radio, the silence inside the car matching the quiet clarity that had settled within her, and by the time she pulled into the driveway, there was no trace of hesitation left in her expression, only a calm, steady focus that had replaced the uncertainty of the days before. The house looked exactly the same as it always had, the same front porch, the same curtains in the windows, the same carefully maintained garden, and for a moment, she stood there with her hand resting on the door handle, not out of doubt, but as if acknowledging that everything she was about to do would change the meaning of this place forever. Inside, nothing had moved, nothing had shifted, but Margaret no longer saw the house as a collection of memories. She saw it as something defined, something structured, something that could be protected or taken depending on who understood it better. And that realization guided her next steps with quiet precision. She walked directly to the desk, opened the drawer, and this time, she did not simply look. She gathered, selecting the documents she needed. Not all of them, not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to begin building her own understanding separate from what had been quietly arranged without her. That evening, when Daniel returned, he carried himself with the same composed ease he had shown for days, asking simple questions, offering small remarks about his day, and Margaret responded just as calmly, her tone unchanged, her movements steady, as if nothing at all had shifted between them. And that was exactly what allowed her to see him more clearly than ever before. Because now she was no longer reacting to his behavior. She was studying it. Over the next few days, Margaret continued exactly as she had always been, maintaining every routine, every small habit that made her presence predictable, dependable, almost invisible in its consistency. And in that quiet space, she began to make her own arrangements, phone calls made at appropriate times, questions asked carefully, information gathered without urgency, each step deliberate, each decision measured. She did not confront Daniel. She did not mention Sophia. She did not reveal what she had seen or what she now understood, because she recognized that the strength of her position no longer came from being included in their plans, but from knowing about them while they believed she did not. One evening, as she stood by the window once more, watching the soft glow of the porch light stretch across the yard, Margaret allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, not to question, not to reflect, but simply to acknowledge the shift that had taken place within her, the quiet transition from someone who had trusted without hesitation to someone who now moved with intention and awareness, and there was no bitterness in that moment, no outward anger. Only a calm acceptance of what had been revealed and what it required of her, because they had made a mistake, not in what they were doing, but in what they believed about her. They had assumed that silence meant weakness, that routine meant blindness, that age meant compliance, and Margaret understood now that those assumptions would be the very thing that allowed her to act without interference, without resistance. And when she finally stepped away from the window and turned off the light, her expression remained as composed as ever, but her thoughts were clear, steady, and certain. Because she was no longer waiting for the truth to appear. She had already seen it. And what came next would not be a reaction. It would be a decision.